Before we begin, please note that this video is intended for observation and educational analysis only. It is not recommended to casually imitate extractions without understanding skin condition, hygiene, and risk. At first glance, this may look like a simple case of clogged pores and acne buildup. But when congestion has been present for a long time, the surrounding skin is often more reactive than it appears. In this video, we will look at what may have caused this condition in the first place. Then we will follow the visible changes closely, paying attention not only to the plugs, but also to the skin around them. What matters here is not just whether material comes out, but how the skin responds throughout the process. Even a small visible clog can be part of a much longer pattern of buildup under the surface. So rather than watching only for dramatic change, let's focus on the condition of the skin and what it may be telling us. One major reason behind this kind of acne congestion is excess oil production over time. When sebum output remains high, the pore opening becomes more vulnerable to repeated blockage. Oil by itself does not always create acne, but when it mixes with dead skin cells, the risk of clogging increases. As dead skin accumulates, the opening of the pore can become narrower and less efficient at clearing itself. Once that happens, oil and keratin begin to collect more deeply inside the follicle. Over time, that material may become thicker, more compact, and harder to release. This is one reason some clogged pores appear small on the surface but are stubborn underneath. Another common factor is inconsistent skincare or over-cleansing. When the skin is stripped too often, the barrier can become weaker and more reactive. That reactivity matters because irritated skin tends to respond more strongly to pressure and friction. So in some cases, the issue is not only congestion, but also a skin barrier that is already under stress. Touching the face repeatedly can also contribute to this kind of pattern. Even light contact, when repeated often, adds friction and can worsen local irritation. If the same area has been squeezed before, that area may also become more sensitive during future extractions. This is especially important when acne is clustered closely together in one small region. Dense clustering often suggests that the issue has been developing gradually, not all at once. In many long-standing cases, what we see on the surface is only part of the overall buildup. Some of the darker plugs visible here may appear dark because of oxidation near the surface. Others may look pale or skin-colored, but still contain compacted material below. That is why color alone does not tell us how deep or how firm a clog may be. To understand a case like this, we also have to look at redness, texture, and the condition of the surrounding skin. So instead of assuming one single cause, it helps to think about oil, dead skin, friction, sensitivity, and prior irritation together. That broader view gives us a better understanding of how this condition likely developed. Now let's move into the visible analysis and look more carefully at the pores themselves. The first thing that stands out is that not every pore appears to be blocked in the same way. Some spots look darker and more open, while others appear more closed, pale, or slightly raised. That difference suggests that the congestion is not at the same stage across the entire area. Some clogs may already be sitting closer to the surface, while others are likely deeper and more compact. This matters because movement and resistance can vary significantly from one pore to another. The skin surface here also appears somewhat shiny, which suggests higher oil activity. On oilier skin, one visible extraction often does not mean the surrounding area is fully clear. It is common to remove one clog while several similar ones remain nearby. That is why focusing on only one dramatic pore can make us miss the bigger pattern. At this point, what matters most is not just the size of a single pore, but how the skin around it looks. If faint redness is already present, that may indicate that the area has already experienced some irritation. When repeated pressure is applied at that stage, the tissue around the pore may take more damage than the material inside. Even when visual change seems small, skin can respond very quickly to friction, pressure, and repeated contact. That is why analysis should include not only the extraction itself, but also the color and texture around it. Some of the darker spots here have a fairly defined outline. A more defined dark border may suggest that oxidation has been present for a while. But a darker clog does not always mean it is deeper or more difficult. On the other hand, a pale or less visible clog may still be tightly packed below the surface. So in many cases, the condition of the pore opening matters more than color alone. When the opening appears more open, the contents may move more easily. When the opening is tighter, the clog often resists movement much more strongly. In this kind of footage, both easier and more stubborn types often appear in the same area. That mixture is one reason these cases cannot be judged in a single uniform way. Another detail worth noticing is the difference in texture from one plug to another. Some appear softer and more ready to move, while others look thicker, drier, or more resistant. When the contents are firmer, the skin may redden before the clog itself changes very much. This is often where people overestimate how much more pressure is still acceptable. The less responsive a clog looks, the easier it becomes to overdo the force. Now, if we look at the surface texture, there also appears to be some unevenness and dryness-related stress. It is not unusual for skin to be both oily and surface dry at the same time. When that happens, the skin may be more vulnerable than the shine alone would suggest. So the amount of congestion does not always reflect the actual resilience of the skin. That is an important point, because heavy congestion does not automatically mean the skin can tolerate heavy pressure. This visible raised area may suggest that some of the material is already closer to the exit. But even when a plug looks raised, movement may still be limited if the opening is narrow. In other words, surface shape can be helpful, but it is not a guarantee. At this stage, the redness does not appear severe, but the skin also does not look fully calm. Mild redness is often the phase where overload is easiest to underestimate. That is why the absence of major inflammation does not always mean the risk is low. In this case, the overall pattern looks more like chronic congestion than a single inflamed breakout. Chronic congestion may appear less dramatic, but it tends to repeat more persistently. So it is important not to judge the whole condition from one short moment alone. When the clogged pores are arranged in a repeating pattern, that often points to a broader oil and keratin issue across the area. It may not be just one problem pore, but an environment that repeatedly favors clogging. That is why looking only at the most obvious extraction is rarely enough. Another useful clue is the uneven way the skin surface reflects light. Balanced, healthy hydration usually looks different from localized shine caused by oil buildup. When the shine is uneven, The nature of each clog may also vary more from one pore to another. Some plugs may be softer and oilier, while others are drier and more compact. The firmer the blockage, the more important it becomes to assess the pore opening and surrounding skin before anything else. That is why careful observation often matters more than speed. At this point, the skin seems oil dominant and prone to repeated congestion. At the same time, the surrounding tissue does not appear especially strong against irritation. That combination calls for a more cautious reading than the visual drama alone might suggest. Highly visible plugs naturally draw attention first. But in many real cases, the surrounding skin condition determines the outcome more than the plug itself. So it helps to keep asking, is the opening suitable and is the redness increasing? The multiple clogs visible here are not all giving the same signal. Some raised plugs may be more ready to move. Some flatter ones may be more likely to remain even if they seem less dramatic. Once those differences become easier to notice, the footage starts to look very different. You stop watching only for removal and start asking why each pore behaves the way it does. That shift in perspective is what turns extraction footage into analysis content. By now, this no longer looks like a temporary surface issue alone. It appears more likely to reflect accumulated sebum, retained keratin, and repeated local stress over time. That is exactly why background and pattern matter more than visual impact alone. Now let's continue by looking at how different kinds of clogs may behave across the area. A larger visible clog may show movement more clearly, but that does not always make it simpler. Larger clogs can also concentrate pressure more intensely on the tissue around them. Smaller clogs may look less dramatic, but they often invite repeated contact because the change seems slower. That repeated attention can become its own source of skin burden. So it cannot simply be said that bigger always means harder, or smaller always means easier. Each type has its own challenges. What this comparison shows is that poor response is never fully uniform. Even in the same small area, the appearance changes depending on both the clog and the condition of the surrounding skin. If slight redness continues to remain visible, that may be a small sign that stress is building. Even without dramatic inflammation, subtle changes like this still matter. From an analytical point of view, both the obvious extraction and the less obvious skin reaction deserve attention. If only dramatic visible change is emphasized, the realistic burden on the skin becomes easy to underestimate. At this stage, the area appears to have several factors that support repeated clogging. Oil production, uneven pore openings, and accumulated mild irritation all seem to overlap. That is why the full sequence matters more than one isolated moment. Now let's move into the practical takeaways. And the advice section of this analysis The first important point is that trying to remove every visible clog by force is risky. Skin condition changes from day to day, and what it can tolerate also changes. Whenever redness is already visible or the surface looks irritated, extra caution is necessary. The more noticeable a clog looks, the more tempting it becomes to focus on it. But something being visually obvious does not automatically mean it should be disturbed right away. What matters most is giving priority to the condition of the skin, not just the presence of the clog. Another major point is that hygiene matters more than many people realize. If anything touching the skin is not clean, extra irritation is not the only risk. Additional complications can develop even when the surface did not initially look severe. And after visible extraction, the skin is often more sensitive than it appears. That is why reducing unnecessary contact afterward is already an important form of care. Another useful reminder is that visible change does not always mean the process is complete. Even if the area looks clearer, some retained material may still remain deeper inside. On the other hand, a little remaining congestion may still be preferable if the skin itself remains calm. So in practice, completely clearing everything is not always the best outcome. A better goal is to minimize unnecessary stimulation while respecting the condition of the skin. What this kind of video can teach is not mainly about force, but about judgment. Sometimes the most important question is not which plug looks biggest, but which area is becoming more reactive. In daily care, it helps to avoid rubbing too hard and touching too often. Over-cleansing and friction can destabilize the skin even when the goal is to reduce oil. The oilier the skin, the more important balance becomes. Trying to solve oil with harsher and harsher stimulation often creates a cycle of more irritation instead of more clarity. Another common issue is repeatedly focusing on one visible spot until that area becomes overworked. An area that is touched again and again is more likely to hold redness, even from smaller forms of irritation. That is why it is important to stay calm even when a visible clog feels distracting. If the skin already feels red, stings, or looks rough, forcing additional change is not a good idea. In that kind of situation, the overall stability of the skin should come first. If the goal is to learn from footage like this, the most valuable skill is careful interpretation. It helps to ask, which pores look more ready to move, and where does the burden begin to outweigh the benefit? Before we close, let's organize the key points from the full sequence one more time. First, this condition appears to be rooted in accumulated sebum and retained dead skin. Second, even when clogged pores look similar, their actual behavior may differ a lot. Third, it is important to look not only at the clog, but also at surrounding redness, shine, and texture. Fourth, the visible result should always be weighed together with the cost paid by the skin. And finally, hygiene and stimulation control remain essential throughout the entire process. Once this full pattern becomes clear, the same kind of footage begins to look very different. It becomes less about watching a dramatic extraction and more about learning how to read the skin. That shift also helps create some distance from an overly sensational way of viewing acne content. The greatest value here comes from expanding attention beyond the clog alone and toward the full skin environment. Even when one plug stands out, the first step should still be to assess the surrounding area carefully. Redness, shine, pore, shape, and uneven texture all provide useful information. It is important not to be pulled only by what is easiest to see. Subtle reactions are often the most meaningful ones. That is what leads to a deeper understanding while also respecting the skin itself. I hope this analysis helps build a more careful way of looking at acne extractions and clogged pores. Rather than focusing only on dramatic visible change, try paying closer attention to the smaller reactions in the skin. Skin does not react the same way every time, and its condition can shift greatly from one moment to another. That is why it is important not to simplify everything based on one short scene. Thank you for watching all the way through. In this video, we followed the causes, visible condition, reactions, and practical cautions step by step. In future videos as well, let's keep looking beyond the extraction itself and continue learning how to read the skin more carefully.